Okay, well, where we left it was whaling and sealing, and the early colonial developments of more populations, Europeans starting to arrive. And we're going to look at 1840, which was when the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, up to what's happening in the present day with the introduction of the quota management system. These are the phases that we'll be talking about: the early colonial phase, the early industrial phase, coastal development phase, government intervention phase, development phase, early exclusive economic zone, and the inshore fishery 1986 onwards, the quota management system. And we'll leave the quota management system it's much too complicated for this video, so that will take separate videos all by itself. So the early colonial phase, 1840 to 1870, here's what you're going to expect to see. Local people, locally fishing off the rocks, small scale. Look at the size of this snapper, just quite easily caught off of the rocks with a hand line. So the early colonial phase, a cottage industry would be a good way to describe this fishery. Generally netting and line fishing by local people, and usually in coastal, shallow waters, very close. They didn't need to go very far in order to catch a lot of fish. And there wasn't really any organization or any limit set except by the local, the kaitiaki, the local chief. They would really catch what they needed to supply the local demand. There wasn't any refrigeration. There was a little bit of smoking or drying fish in order to preserve it. Yeah, so they were occasionally smoked or cured, dried, but generally if people wanted fish, they would go out and catch some and they would eat what was caught within the last day or two. And European population kept increasing. More people arrived, and so did they. So some of them took up fishing as a way of life. No legislation, no administration, no regulation. You could catch and sell whatever you could catch and sell. So populations kept growing. As we said, the European population kept growing. More people arrived from Europe, and so with greater populations, then industries sort of developed. And so notice this person holding a boarfish. These things are not as common as they were around the coast at the time. So this would have been somebody going out and netting for a larger population, and obviously quite a few people coming to buy fish if this is the type of, if they're catching this amount. So the first fishing companies evolved with this greater scale, and people started to realize that they could actually sell fish if they could preserve it back to Europe, where people were quite used to eating canned fish, and they started canning mullet and other fish, and in that way you could keep catching fish, and it wouldn't go off if you couldn't sell it all in the first day or two. And San Francisco was started in that period. It still survives today. Oh, there's a little fish swimming in. Netting and long lining would have been the major types of fishing at that point, and also dredging for oysters and mussels. Then as well, people started to develop coastal shipping in order to supply mail around the country, and so places like Stewart Island, Dunedin, and these larger scale cities could be supplied, or Stewart Island had a lot of fish. Dunedin had a lot of population, so people could settle into further away from these population centers and still make a living. Okay, the early industrial phase was the big change that allowed it to really ramp up was development of ice makers. So when refrigeration technology came in order to allow people to make a lot of money off of the sheep that they were raising. Previously, what had happened was all the people had sent the wool back to Europe that was grown here, but with the sheep. But the meat was really consumed locally, and there wasn't really a market for it. They couldn't you couldn't actually eat all the meat that was raised in trying to supply the wool market. But now with refrigeration and having meatworks, you could also sell the meat back to Europe and also to Australia and make a bit of extra money, a second income off of your same sheep. Now, people could start also freezing fish and using that technology to export fresh fish. Oysters were even exported live in bags. And finally, the government became involved after there were local depletions around Auckland and around Dunedin, and they started to put in some minimum regulations, as in how big of it your net could be, and then closed seasons on oysters. So at this point as well, people started, especially local populations and Maori especially, who were impacted on with their ability to collect seafood to feed their families, started calling for regulation, and they actually appointed a minister of Marine and Marine Department with in order to try to conserve the industry, okay, and also develop it in places that it was underdeveloped or considered underdeveloped. So that ushered in the coastal development phase. And with this is another technology that allowed the fisheries to greatly expand. So there was steam trawlers had been developed, and this allowed people to actually pull a little bit more gear. You had a much more powerful vessel, whereas before you could only pull something that the sails would allow you to drag through the water. Now with steam trawlers turning a propeller, you can obviously pull a big net or a big beam through the water, and so the government bought a boat, and here it is, the SS Dodo, and organized trawling expeditions all around the coast. So they essentially went and did some trawls. It took a couple of years to do it, to just do some spot trawls pretty much everywhere they could around the New Zealand coast, close to shore. So they would have gone up and down Papamoa Beach a couple of times just to see what was there. And interestingly enough, amazingly enough, a major proportion of the catch at one point was hapaka. So things have changed quite a bit. And this is the type of scale of the fishery. So remember, we've gone from that woman fishing off of the rocks with a hand line up to a small rowboat full of fish, and now we're getting into larger scale bags of fish that have come up off of the trawl. Long lines were introduced, industrial scale long lines, Danish seining. That's using, it's a smallish net, but it herds fish with a rope, a very, very long rope, and then lobster potting. And because of these industrial methods, some areas the catches started to drop drastically, and people started to think that fisheries might not be completely inexhaustible. Before the early 1900s, people would look at the amount of eggs in a fish, and they're sort of thinking like a chicken can lay an egg a day, but if it's a if it's going to lay eggs that it's going to take care of and hatch, then maybe it'll hatch one or two or broods in a year. Even something that would be considered something that can explode in population, like mice or rabbits, might have 2 or 3 broods in a year, and that's quite. You're talking 8 or 10 offspring per individual. Whereas they looked at fish and thought there are 100,000, 200,000, half a million eggs in every fish. One fish can vastly repopulate a population, and so they thought that fisheries would be completely inexhaustible because they thought the eggs would be as successful as a chicken egg. But in fact, that's not true. Most of them die. And so then people started to realize, hey, maybe we can actually exhaust a fishery. And that's when people started to really study how you go about managing a fishery so it doesn't collapse. So at that point in the 30s, they hit the handbrake with the government intervention phase. So they appointed a minister who was very much more conservation minded here in New Zealand. And they inquired into the fishery, and they decided that there was too much fishing going on, and they established a marine department, and they said that people would now have to have licenses in order to fish. And this is how they would go about limiting the expansion of the fishery and the effort that went into the fishery. So with that meant that more and more boats couldn't just get into the fishery, start competing for those fish. And what we had were seasonal fishing closures, more restrictions on gear, size of the vessels, and so the rapid development of that fishery, of those fisheries generally slowed down very quickly. Here are some interesting early interventions that give you a very good idea of how fisheries regulations often go. So in 1945, vessels were required to operate from and land fish at a place specified in the license, usually a single port. And what happened was that people thought, oh well, they won't be able to go and fish all the areas if they have to claim a home port, or they won't be able to go and overfish one area because they can limit how many boats are fishing from that spot. But what happened was people just got bigger boats and put refrigeration onto those boats and steamed away. And also, 1959, after the World War II and lots of hungry populations around the world were growing, and lots of vessels left over from the war effort were converted to fishing. People started to look for fresh areas all around the world, and Japanese fishing vessels were started to be seen around the late 50s. So they also started to look at the pelagic fisheries like kahawai and like tuna and the like, and more and more fishing vessels from foreign countries were starting to be seen around the territory of New Zealand, close to New Zealand, and so they kept this very limited limited entry for new vessels into the fishery up until 1962. But then people started thinking, actually, we could make a lot more money if we started exporting the fish that we have. And look at all these other foreign vessels that are fishing here. Why are we just letting them make all the money off of this? So they had a major change. And that's the development phase came in 1963, and things really started taking off. So in 1962, they had the committee that looked into fisheries, and they reversed the policies. And so the full development was now the policy, and conservation was really only maximum yield on a continuing basis. How much can we possibly get out of this fishery without it collapsing? So fishing licenses became fishing permits. Anybody could now get a fishing permit. And so they thought, well, how can we get this fish into foreign markets? And they did that. They froze it and looked for foreign markets around the world. And as these markets started demanding fish, more and more people started getting into the fishery to supply those markets. And so at that point, we only had a 3-mile territorial sea, and vessels were fishing straight over or straight up to that 3-mile limit, and inside of it. So you might see a Japanese fishing vessel going up and down the Papamoa beach, fishing with trawls, trying to catch snapper and whatever else it could catch, and then steam back to Japan to unload its catch. These were really big boats, and people thought, oh, this is a bit on the nose, so they established a 9-mile fishing zone. Okay, now this was something that was other countries were doing at the same time, but didn't really have any grounding in international law. New Zealand just said, okay, you're not allowed to come within 9 miles, and we're going to confiscate your vessel if you do. No, that we didn't have a lot of fleets to enforce that, though, and there were a lot of infringements. So here's a whole other list of people countries that were trawling and fishing in New Zealand water, close to New Zealand territory through 1977. So this was happening really all around the world. Foreign international fleets were trying to fish anywhere they could catch fish, and 9-mile coastal limits were the only places that or the only limits that were being enforced. Legally, that was all that could be enforced. Now, also with the development of things like nuclear submarines and the Cold War, people started to think, well, maybe we should start to it's not a good idea to have vessels that can launch nuclear weapons 12 miles or 9 miles from our coast. So the exclusive economic zone concept came into place in the late 70s, and this was not just New Zealand, but an international concept that started to gain purchase. And the deep water fishery was started to be developed. Things like orange roughy were found in the late 70s, and the government started thinking, well, this is something that New Zealand should be taking advantage of, and they started putting government money into catching and processing facilities and low interest loans for purchasing vessels to develop the fishery. And finally, in 1978, in the early exclusive economic zone, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was ratified by quite a few countries. So that formally established the exclusive economic zone, which gave all countries with a border on the ocean a chance to exclusively control the resources within that zone. That includes really all economic activity, extractive resources within a limit of 200 nautical miles from the coast. That doesn't mean that you can't go into those waters. You can still sail into those waters up to 12 nautical miles from any coast, with any vessel you choose. So offshore fishing expanded rapidly with all those government incentives. Some foreign vessels were used because they said, well, we have these foreign charter, we have these co-agreements because we don't have enough vessels to fish, like the Hoki fishery. So we got, there were joint ventures, which were New Zealand companies with foreign vessels fishing in them. Finally, 81, 82, foreign licensed vessels were excluded from the valuable fishing grounds. One of the interesting things about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was that fish was considered valuable enough, and there were enough hungry people in the world that people agreed that is a resource that should be used, and that it's not fair for you to just say, as a country, we're not going to fish our fishery, because that's sort of limiting other people in the world from who may want that resource from being able to access it. And so if you weren't able to access that fishery and fish it to maximum sustainable yield, by law, according to that convention, you had to let other vessels fish your waters. Finally, 81, 82, we considered our fishery developed enough that, and the New Zealand fleet developed enough that we could exclude foreign licensed vessels from certain grounds. New Zealand fishing companies kept they started importing the bigger trawlers, and in 82, in order to try to control the offshore fisheries, the New Zealand government sort of allocated the permitting to these seven profitable deepwater species to a few companies that had proved that they had the investment in onshore processing facilities and vessels, and that they were able to handle a certain large quantity of the product. And this was supposed to make the fishery more efficient. So here's some interesting statistics of what was happening, and it led, in 1984, this was only what was measured, this is only what was landed, and there would have been a lot of discards, as we've seen in the press recently with catch reconstructions. 440,000 tons taken, 166 from domestic fishing vessels. So we're at this point, the fishing pressure was very, very large. Okay, lots and lots of fish were being extracted, probably too much. And with some fisheries declining, and even some of the deep water fisheries starting to decline, what would happen would be these large vessels would just go inshore and start fishing as well. They'd be catching snapper and other shallow species, and they were built to fish in deep water, but then they'd come to supplement their catch in shallow fishing. And so you're getting these vessels with 100-meter wide trawl nets fishing up and down, again, the Papamoa coast and places like that. And people will tell you that the snapper fishery in the 80s was not in good shape. Old timers will tell you that the fishing has gotten better since then. And it was in very bad shape, and nobody really knew exactly what to do. But in 1986, the quota management system was introduced as an all-encompassing management system. This is way too complex to keep going with this video, so we will be looking at the quota management system and what came out of it over subsequent lessons.